Hello, everyone, and welcome to the National Education Summit session, Concealed and Revealed, Complex Histories of Postal Imagery. My name is Jessie Aucoin, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Education and Visitor Services at the National Postal Museum. And I'm so excited to be here with you all, along with my colleague, Maureen Leary. And we hope that you find the range of postal-related content today both interesting and challenging. The Postal Museum is one of the smaller units at the Smithsonian and less well known than many of our counterparts, but we actually have the second largest collection at the institution with over 6 million objects. And a big chunk of these objects is, of course, postage stamps. And we love talking about stamps, but our collection is much broader than that, and we are definitely more than a stamp museum. We are, at heart, an American history museum, and we offer comprehensive historical content on the Postal Museum, on the Postal Service in the US, mail and mail delivery, postal transportation, postal innovations, and all the people, places, and things that have been and continue to be so vital to the operations of the United States Postal Service. Our agenda is pretty straightforward. I'll start with a presentation on postage stamps, the images they depict, and what that says about American history, culture, or values. From there, Maureen will explore post office murals with you all, revealing some of the uncomfortable truths about the topics portrayed. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Maureen for a minute.
Thank you, Jessie. My name is Maureen Leary, and I am the Youth and Family Programs Manager at the museum. I will briefly go over our goals and objectives with you. We hope that you will expand your understanding of how postage stamps are approved for issue, that you will use guiding questions to examine how the United States Postal Service, or the USPS, portray complicated topics on stamps, that you will gain introductory knowledge on the history of post office murals, and that you will use guiding questions to examine how post office murals portray complicated topics in American history. We also hope that you will leave this program feeling inspired to use postal imagery in your own teaching environments to encourage critical thinking, historical analysis, and deep questioning. And Jessie will get us started.
Thanks, Maureen. So like I said earlier, during my section of our session today, we will be exploring postage stamps and what the images conveyed on them tell us about American history, culture, and values. We're going to do this by examining both what is included in the stamps and images and what is noticeably absent from the images. Now, I know for the teachers that are here with us today, there are no standards of learning that call out postal service or postage stamps, as shocking as that may be to hear. But as you will hopefully soon see, the materials developed and distributed by the United States Postal Service depict important moments and individuals in history, serving as either primary or secondary sources, depending on the topic at hand. But before we can begin to unravel some of the complex conversations centering around the images selected for US postage stamps, I thought it best to begin by shedding some light on the process stamps go through before being issued. And that means you are now going to get introduced to the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee, also known as CSAC. Now, without knowing the specific details, I think it won't be a huge surprise for you to hear that CSAC oversees the process of stamp design. At its simplest form, that includes the progression of a design from an artist's study or sketch, such as this one, to an original piece of artwork with clear overlays of text that can be easily adjusted or edited, such as the one that you're going to see on your screen, and then to the final postage stamp issued, which you'll see again. What you may not be aware of, though, is the process taken to even get to that initial artist sketch or study, which is also overseen by CSAC. First, I should let you know that anyone can submit a stamp design idea to CSAC. In fact, on average, they receive over 30,000 design ideas from all over the country every year. And if after today's program you feel inspired to submit your own concept to them, you can find more information on how to do so on their website, which can be found through a simple internet search. But since the USPS only issues 20 to 30 stamps a year, out of those 30,000 ideas that they get, there is a lot of work that CSAC must do to whittle down the list of candidates. And so to help with that, they have some basic rules and expectations that every stamp must adhere to. So first, every stamp must fit into one of three overarching categories: people, places and events, or things, which essentially means that any noun can be a stamp. And obviously there are a lot of nouns in this world. So to help narrow down the options even further, each stamp concept must also meet specific criteria. And although there are 11 criteria in total, only 4 apply to every stamp design submission. They all must be American or American related. And they will consider other subjects, but only if they've had a significant impact on American history or culture. They all must be historically significant or reflect enduring contributions to American life, which then must also be deemed as a positive contribution. And lastly, they must all be of something that will resonate with people across the whole country. And you can see some examples of stamps that are being issued throughout the year 2022 here on your screen, so you can get an idea of what meets those requirements. So now that you know a little bit more about CSAC and their work, I think it's important for you to meet the members. Here you see all 13 of the current members on the committee, each of whom, as is tradition, was appointed by the Postmaster General. CSAC members are selected for their expertise in specific subject areas. Current members include world-renowned historians, award-winning doctors, successful entrepreneurs, and change makers, among others. Something that I've been talking about and kind of around without going into too specific detail in hopes that you would kind of get there on your own is the inherent weight behind the messages postage stamps convey. We don't have time to get into the intricacies of the Postal Service's balance between being a federal agency or a private corporation. That's an entire session on its own right. But the fact remains that irrespective of their business status, the United States Postal Service is viewed as a representation of the US government. So, by extension, each and every stamp they issue is also viewed as an official representation or opinion of the US government. So when we look at the process of getting a stamp issued and the resulting realization that it is just a small group of individuals that make those decisions, what happens if we don't have a diverse committee? What happens when committee members aren't inclined to take the perspectives of communities other than their own into account when working on a design? What happens if committee members advocate for stamps to include messages that are in the best interests of only a select few? And all of these are things that have happened at different moments in American history. And when you take a moment to think about the power that these stamps hold as perceived official representation of the US government, things can get really complicated really quickly. In a minute, we're going to look at a stamp that addresses some of these complexities. But first, I wanted to show you some stamps that have been issued that have resulted in controversy and confusion. So if we could advance to the next slide, please. 2 of the 11 stamp criteria I mentioned earlier that CSAC must adhere to, 2 more of the 11 are that 1, no person can be featured on a stamp until after their death. And honestly, that's partially designed to ensure the Postal Service doesn't celebrate someone and their achievements before we have a comprehensive understanding of who they really were. And the second one is that every president must be on the stamp. So with the country well aware of his behavior while in office, the Postal Service has only issued 1 stamp featuring Richard Nixon. So they met their mandate about presidents, but they did so with as little fanfare as possible because of his reputation, and trying to, move past his behavior that they don't want to really promote. The controversy of the middle stamp isn't because of the picture itself or the meaning, but more about the design. More than one person in my time at the Postal Museum has asked why we have a stamp showing children that are being hypnotized by a floating key. And honestly, I don't have an answer. There's no good answer to that, but it is a stamp. And lastly, the Statue of Liberty stamp from 2010 made some major headlines when it was realized that it, in fact, is not a picture of the Statue of Liberty, but is actually a photograph of the sculpture of the Statue of Liberty outside the New York Casino in Las Vegas. And the sculptor, Robert S. Davidson, had made modifications from the original Statue of Liberty to make his, as he put it, more fresh-faced, sultry, and sexy. And since USPS didn't credit him for his work before they put it on a stamp, they were forced to pay him $3.5 million in damages. All right, so if we could go to the next slide, now that you have a better understanding or a bit better of understanding the process by which stamps are issued, I want to work with you through a thinking routine called Beauty and Truth. For anyone unfamiliar with thinking routines, these are educational frameworks to use in the classroom that help keep topics engaging, help distill complicated information, or work to develop personal connections to the material. And Beauty and Truth was designed to use close looking as a way to uncover the complexities below the visual surface of the object or the image. Postage stamps and the events or individuals they portray as important to the United States are a really unique and often overlooked avenue then to practice with this with. So if we go on to the next slide, I want us to look at a stamp titled The Vietnam War, which was issued in 1999. Over the course of 2 years, right before the start of the new millennium, the Postal Service released 10 different series, one for each decade of the 1900s, highlighting accomplishments and historic moments of the time. And this was one of the 15 images selected to represent the 1960s. I don't think any of us would argue that the Vietnam War was of monumental importance to the country during the 1960s. But if we think about the 4 criteria CSAC must ensure applies to every stamp issued, including the one about positive contributions to American life and history, the stamp starts to get a little bit more puzzling. So I want us to work through those complexities together. If we could advance the slide, you'll see there are 2 questions that we're going to start by asking. Where can you find beauty in this image of the event? And then the next advancement on the slide you'll see is, where do you find truth in this picture? So if we could advance the slide one more time, please. Thank you. In the Q&A feature, I would like you to think about the things that you find beautiful or appealing in this image on the stamp. These can be either actual or metaphorical beautiful things. And I also want you to think about the things that you find to be really honest or truthful in it. While you do that, I'm going to ask Maureen to come back on screen, and she and I are going to talk about this a little bit. And I'm going to ask her to share with us what she finds beautiful or truthful in this stamp. And if she can't come on screen, she may be a disembodied voice. So just as a warning. So Maureen, any thoughts?
So it's an interesting question because it is a little hard to separate the history of the Vietnam War with an image and just take it at face value. But I think you can look at this and really see the youth and vitality of the U.S. soldiers who were out there, fulfilling what I'm sure they, in many cases, believed to be their patriotic duty to the country. So I think that that's a place where you can find some beauty in this image.
Anything about the truth part that you find striking?
So again, it's tricky to put a positive spin on anything really relevant in the Vietnam War, but I do think you can look at the truth. Maybe think about the physical landscape that the soldiers were faced with, which had many different features to it. In this case, it looks like sort of dry scrubland, but I know there was also, other things they dealt with, monsoons and those kinds of things that maybe speak to the courage that soldiers had to have to endure that, and the commitment to fulfilling their duty, and just kind of the fortitude and also I think the unpredictability. Maybe, I mean, you get the sense from this image they're jumping out of a helicopter. I mean, this is clearly not something that's easy. Maybe they don't know exactly what they're going to be faced with in this, in whatever happens next.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Kim has added in the Q&A, she mentions that she doesn't see a lot of beauty, but really does think it seems to be an honest images of the soldiers on the ground. And I think that's a little bit of what you're trying to get at, Maureen, too, is that like the beauty is the harder part to understand here. But like I said, there is the concept of metaphorical beauty, right? So when we're looking at the relationships that these individuals have with one another and the trust that they must have with each other, because of course, although I'm not from a military family myself, there is that brothers in arms concept, right? That is a huge part of your military experience or any sort of war experience. And so I think that there's a beauty there in the relationship part of the stamp. But again, when we think about Vietnam War, it's certainly not a particularly beautiful moment in American history. I'm going to move on to the next slide too, because there's two other questions I want us to look at a little bit more with this. So the next two rounds of questions, which are a little bit more challenging, in my opinion, is how might beauty reveal truth? But then also conversely, how might beauty conceal truth? And, I would say that these questions don't necessarily apply to every single object that you might use for this thinking routine, but they are really two sides of the same coin. And so I do want to take a moment to still explore them today. So just like before, for our participants, if you want to share your thoughts, please do so in the Q&A section. But while you gather your ideas and while you kind of mull over this concept of the, beauty concealing truth versus beauty revealing truth, I'm going to turn back to you, Maureen. My apologies. So I want us to start by asking you, when you think about stamps as a primary source, they are created just like any other primary source that we have. And CSAC and therefore by extension, the USPS are really intentional with their stamp designs and issues, perhaps not so with the Statue of Liberty, but with other issues that they've had. So, what beauties and the truths are being selectively concealed or revealed in the stamp, or in other words, like what's the intended message that we're supposed to be receiving by looking at this image of the Vietnam War stamp? Any thoughts?
Well, I think with this stamp in particular, it's, just the fact that it was chosen to be on a stamp in the first place is interesting. As you mentioned before, I think most people who know the history at all wouldn't necessarily depict the Vietnam War as a positive event. But it might be something that the government wants to try to put a bit of a more positive spin on for us. Maybe particularly thinking about all those people who returned from the Vietnam War and lived through that experience, and maybe wanting to have it acknowledged or honored in some way, even if it wasn't an involvement that most of the country agreed with. It's still an experience that so many people went through. And so, maybe there is some piece to that truth of it that is worth, commemorating and acknowledging for all those people who sacrificed so much.
Yeah. I'm struck by a lot of the same things. And then I'm also, really interested in thinking about how, of course, these are US stamps, right? So these are depicting a very American-centric interpretation of the event. So I've been struck a few times when I look at the stamp and think about the beauty and truth and, the ways that things are concealed, revealed, what have you. I often think about like how somebody who was living in Vietnam at the time would respond to this image of these kind of almost feel like American, like just conquerors is the wrong word that I'm struggling to find, but just this bold, brash, we're coming to save you sort of approach. And if that's, how truthful is that from the perspective of those living in Vietnam in the 1960s? Did they need us to be there to come in the first place? Annalise mentions in the Q&A that she, thinks beauty is really hard to see in this image. As we mentioned, truth and the idea of soldiers jumping on the ground and making the idea of fighting to come as more real, become more real is a lot more of a metaphorical beauty. And I think that there's a great comment that Mary has mentioned as well about the landscape and the activity hide the brutality of the war, right? So you're struck by kind of, I think, Mary, what I'm getting from that comment is you're struck by like the artistic presentation and how the image is formatted, and how it's closed in such a tight image that you're losing the context and you're therefore losing the reality of the warfare that's going on around them. And so in the effort to compose a really beautiful shot, you're concealing the truth of what is happening around them. That's great. I would love to talk about these more. I could talk about this for hours. I think there's so many layers and nuances, and it really does depend a lot on people's experiences and individual opinions because of that. But due to time, I want to make sure that Maureen gets time to talk to you all a little bit, because we've had some really thoughtful comments about postage stamps here, but she's going to transition and talk to us about another art form associated with the Postal Service, which is post office murals. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you to advance the slide, and Maureen's going to take over.
Thank you, Jessie. And though I am going to be covering the topic of post office murals, first we are going to look at a few postage stamps for just a moment to talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Like all deceased presidents, like Richard Nixon, as we saw, FDR's likeness has been featured on postage stamps. He actually got 4 postage stamps for him. And he was also an avid stamp collector himself. As we know, FDR became president during a tumultuous time. The Great Depression that began in 1929 meant that millions of Americans were unemployed or underemployed. After taking office, Roosevelt quickly announced the New Deal, which featured numerous social programs designed to both put people to work and improve their lives. Artists were included in this, at first to give them jobs, which was through the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, a term probably many of you are familiar with, and then to help uplift the population through access to public art. And that was under the Treasury Department. In 1934, the Treasury Department's section of painting and sculpture was officially established. It was later renamed the section of fine arts and then just generally referred to as simply the section. And its mission was to transform federal buildings, mostly post offices, into democratic art galleries. And so I wanted to just take a moment to make a distinction between those two programs because for 2 reasons, I wanted to make that clear. One, many thousands more artists were employed by the WPA programs than by the section. So there's lots and lots of artwork that came out of WPA programs, but the ones we're going to be talking about today were under the auspices of the section, under the Department of Treasury. So any numbers I give or anything I cite about that, we're talking about this particular subset of New Deal artwork, and it was not under the WPA. So I just want to clear that up because I know there's often a lot of confusion about that. Section artworks are commonly mistaken for WPA work. So even if they're referred to that way, if you are looking at a post office mural, it is almost certainly a product of the section and not the WPA. And the program was quite successful in its output. It spanned 9 years. It employed 850 artists, and it produced 1,371 murals. And post offices were selected for this program because in an era before email and cell phones, almost everyone regularly visited the post office to keep in touch with the outside world. And so post offices were really the perfect place to expose average citizens to art. These murals were often the first artworks residents of rural areas had ever seen in person. The painted murals typically measured 10 feet in length and 5 feet in height. And while the finished murals are, of course, mostly still on the walls in their original locations, the Smithsonian is fortunate to have many of the mural studies or the drafts in its collection. And that is mostly what we will be looking at today. So here's an example of a post office mural from Cornelia, Georgia. Many post office murals were pleasant, bucolic scenes like the one that we see here. But of course, if that's all they were, we would not be talking about them right now. The murals covered a wide range of topics and artistic sensibilities. The section primarily used an anonymous selection process that allowed for the inclusion of non-established artists. And among them, there were 162 women, 24 American Indians, and a few from other minority groups. Specifically, there were 3 Black artists and at least a few Latino and Asian artists, although it is actually very difficult to pin down exact numbers because of the frequent conflation with WPA artwork that I mentioned earlier. So women and minorities had some representation among the artists who created this large body of work, although still, not surprisingly, for the 1930s and 40s, these artists were overwhelmingly white men. And once the artists were selected, they were encouraged to pursue themes that were optimistic or historic and avoid conflicts of race, gender, and class. The section wanted artwork that would be accessible and relatable. for local residents. And artists were encouraged to collaborate with the local community when choosing subjects, though in practice, many artists never actually even visited the location where their murals eventually hung, though they did often at least correspond with the postmaster when selecting topics. And then there was a design approval process that was very tightly controlled by the section. So the next mural we're going to look at is called Tobacco Auction, and it is by Richard Kina. And I chose this one as an example of a mural that was acceptable at the time when it was painted, but that many find troubling in a modern context. It has attracted some attention in the press, and there are some mixed reactions to it by the public. For many, it evokes the break-backing work of enslaved people who built the wealth of our nation while simultaneously being excluded from it. This mural was created during the Jim Crow era when post offices, like the one where this mural still hangs, were segregated for both employees and customers. There's actually an active change.org petition to get this mural removed. But on the other hand, there is also a recent article written by a relative of the artist who speaks with great pride of the artwork and mentions that the Smithsonian has the mural study in its collection. So even today, there are mixed reactions depending on. This is actually pretty common with this body of work. Again, as murals provide an entry into the cultural attitudes at the time. And some of those attitudes really haven't stood the test of time very well. But the communities where the murals are may nevertheless really feel a sense of pride in their historic value, or that they have a mural in their community. So moving on from this specific example to the next slide. As I mentioned, there were, of course, many different kinds of things depicted on these murals. First, there were many, many murals showing everyday scenes of leisure and community. I have 3 examples of this to share with you. I'm going to show each one briefly, and then you'll see them all together on one slide. I want you to keep in mind anything you notice about how these images are similar, and we will come back to that shortly. So kind of make a mental note as we look at these 3 slides, one at a time and then together. So moving on to the next one. This one is called Local Industries from Springdale, Kansas. Moving on to the next one. This is Festival at Hamburg from Hamburg, Iowa. This is actually a very famous one. And if we go to the next slide, you can see all 3 of them together. And so again, I ask you to just take a look, make a mental note of any commonalities that you notice between these 3 murals here. Right, and moving on to the next slide. I mentioned that those slides were all about leisure and community, which was a really popular topic for post office murals. Another major topic was local industry. So I'm going to show you 3 examples of this, and I'd like you to do the same thing that you did for the other set of slides. Notice what you see in common among the 3 images. So this is the first one called Cotton Pickers from Wayne, Arkansas. And then if we go to the next one, this one's called Cotton Scene from Hartselle, Alabama. And then the final one is called Past and Present Agriculture and Industry of Colleton County in South Carolina. And then on the next slide, you can see the 3 of these slides together. And again, I ask you to think about the commonalities. What do you see in common? And then go ahead. Yes, go ahead to the next one. So now I'm going to ask the audience to use the Q&A feature to share with us what observations you made while looking at these 2 sets of murals. And so what stands out to you about how these 2 sets of murals are similar or different from each other? When you look at the 6 of them together, these 2 sets of 3, what do you think they reveal? Thinking about, the cultural attitudes at the time, as we talked about briefly. Is there anything that they conceal rather than reveal? So just thinking about both of those things that Jessie talked about a little bit, concealing and revealing, and thinking about the artist perspective. Just what do you notice about how these different themes are depicted in these murals? And while we are waiting for some comments to come in, I'm going to ask Jessie to join me for a little bit of conversation.
Hi. I hate to answer your question with an answer, but Maureen, I got it. I have to do so. Before I really kind of go down the rabbit hole of what strikes me most, I'm curious if these reflect kind of an average, or are they kind of standard for the different types of murals that you're seeing in post offices, or were these chosen for specific reasons? I just want to gauge,
Sure. No, that's absolutely a great question. I'm glad you brought it up. So of course, as I mentioned, there's almost 1,400 of these murals, and we're only seeing a very small slice. But these are really emblematic of the themes that you see. And so I picked these not as sort of one-offs that are, proving whatever point I might be trying to make.
Right.
Really, as just looking through this large body of work, time and time again, you see these themes and these things are depicted that are so similar. And so it was more a matter of picking out the ones that were similar to many others rather than finding the unique ones. So I would say that these are very, very typical of many of the works that you would see. And of course, it varies depending on geographic location. I mean, you're not going to see slides of people picking cotton from, a mural that's placed in North Dakota. But as far as, so in that sense, I did choose ones that had that similarity.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it definitely is very clear when looking at in a comprehensive way at this body of work that these are themes that are just repeated over and over.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think Leslie took the words right out of my mouth when she put in the Q&A that she's noticing that the leisure images on the left really heavily depict white families or white individuals, and that the images on the right depicting more work and industry are definitely Black and brown people. And it's something that, you notice as you kind of go through the slides, but it's not until the 6 images are really next to each other that there's that clear demarcation of industry, of functionality of life, how these people are living their lives.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, and that is an observation that really struck me when looking at these, and it looks like some folks in our audience noticed that too. We have a comment from someone saying they look like they're working or resting together, and so it is. These are all depictions of community in a sense. Yeah. But in very different ways. So in the slides on the left, with you have pretty much only white people, and they're doing leisurely things, in different ways. It's a picnic, they're hanging out on the farm, they're at a festival. But on the right side, where you have members of the Black community depicted, they're working, and that's really all that you see of that identity group in these murals. Is you don't see those more nuanced aspects of what other parts of life do they experience besides just work. Right. And so that was a very common with these murals, and a really important point to note, that is, they're pretty one-dimensional. They're shown as laborers, and that there aren't any other contributions. I mean, we look back in history and we think about all of the music and all of lots of different ways that there have been so many important cultural contributions from the Black community to the American society at large, and you don't see any of that present in these murals. You basically just see this, they're helping the local industry, but that appears to be, the only piece of life there that's really shown, as being worthy of being on a post office.
It's very dehumanizing in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and so, it really is reflective of the cultural identity at that time. There was a very pervasive power dynamic of, white culture was dominant, was powerful, and all, other cultures, Black culture, other minority cultures were, seen as more subservient. And that's really reflected in the subjects that got chosen. And again, this was, these were sanctioned by the government, just like postage stamps. These were the themes the government was putting out there, and they deliberately told, they told artists, we want things that'll make people happy and uplift, and that's really problematic when you think about, how, when we look at these now, and it's, we have a very different reaction. So thank you, Jessie, for helping me out with that conversation, and thank you, folks, for putting things in the Q&A. And we will have time at the end of our session to get to some of these other questions that have been submitted. But for now, we're going to move on to the next slide. So I think it's pretty clear from the historical record that although the Black community was frequently represented in these post office murals, there was very little nuance to it, as I said, and it certainly did not show nearly as full a picture as it did for the dominant culture. So you might be wondering about other minority identity groups. The Latino and Asian communities were not represented much at all. There were a handful of mural artists from these groups, but any representation that existed was, again, pretty one-dimensional. So here's one example on South Texas Panorama, a mural that's in Alice, Texas. And although you do see different racial groups represented here, and you do see white men in this image as laborers, it is important to note that at the time there was a public perception of a hierarchy of labor. I think you could probably argue that this hierarchy of labor still exists. So if you are a blacksmith or a welder, as we see here, you're using skills or training rather than just doing a physical activity, your work was likely more valued than that of someone, who is a field hand or someone supporting the agrarian economy. So again, we see more of a range in this image, but there's still that power dynamic and that hierarchy present. So on the next slide, you'll see, moving on to a slightly different topic, the depiction of American Indians in these murals is much more varied, but there's still a lot to investigate. Of the nearly 1,400 murals created, almost 400 depict American Indians, but only 24 of the 850 artists selected were American Indians. So most of these were done by non-Indigenous artists. The murals spanned a wide range of themes, and some certainly were culturally sensitive, but most were stereotypical and showed Native Americans as a vanishing race, or as noble savages, or as violent. And also there were many overall inaccuracies. So the mural you see here, called the Battle of Bear River, that's in Preston, Idaho. This is one of the many that openly shows violence. It depicts what is now considered to be the largest massacre of American Indians in the country's history. Accurate numbers of fatalities are hard to come by, but the estimate is that between 250 and 500 men, women, and children of the Shoshone Nation were killed in this unexpected attack by the US cavalry on their encampment. The date was January 29th, 1863, and by all accounts, the weather was very cold and the river was icy. This might cause us to question the artist's motivation in depicting the Shoshone as only wearing loincloths, when historic photographs show their practice was, of course, to wear clothing appropriate for winter weather. So it's also notable that the title of the painting is The Battle at Bear River, when it was largely a one-sided attack. So after decades of this inaccurate characterization being accepted, activism by descendants of the Shoshone survivors of the massacre caused this previously little-known event to be recognized as possibly the deadliest slaughter ever of American Indians on the US frontier. And it is now more commonly referred to as a massacre rather than a battle. The Shoshone Nation holds an annual ceremony commemorating the tragedy. And in 2021, they unveiled the mural you see here called the Bear River Massacre. The mural depicts a peaceful village in the early morning hours with the approaching cavalry in the distance, and it actively works to correct the false narrative perpetuated by the original post office mural. As Darren Perry, the chairman of the Shoshone Nation, explains, it's about us being able to tell our story from our unique perspective. When you give people a voice, especially marginalized communities, that voice is really powerful. Unfortunately, the voice of marginalized communities is almost entirely absent from these historic post office murals. And as we've seen, representation of minority and marginalized communities was often quite problematic. There are so many elements we could explore more deeply here from this massive body of public art. But since our time is winding down, I'd like you to just take a moment to just personally reflect on what approach you think makes sense in dealing with these artworks that might be controversial. Of course, it's hard to generalize because there are many complicated factors at play. But as an overall approach, what do you think strikes the right balance? Does potential harm to one group outweigh the historical significance of an object? Should artistic value be the highest priority? I'm definitely not saying there's one right answer, but it's really interesting to think about. And the United States Postal Service has had to grapple with this in a very concrete way. And their approach has actually been somewhat inconsistent. They have sometimes changed course abruptly. They have done everything from insisting murals remain up exactly as they were originally placed, to providing explanatory text alongside the images, to moving them to a museum, and finally to completely covering or removing them. So in closing, I just want to draw your attention to one additional method the USPS has used to mitigate any harm or offense caused by these murals. The Postal Museum has an extensive virtual exhibit on our website that provides background information and context for many of the murals depicting Indigenous peoples. This exhibit was created in partnership with the National Museum of the American Indian, and all of the murals included in it are very thoroughly researched and explained. And I'm glad to say that this kind of collaboration about post office murals continues to be pursued between the Smithsonian and the United States Postal Service. So with that, we will post our contact information for you for anyone who's interested, and we will open it up to questions for our remaining time.
Gonna start with one of the questions that most closely aligns with what you were talking about just now towards the end of your presentation, Maureen. Susan asks, how many of the problematic murals have been removed? If you know, of course.
Put me on the spot right off the bat. So I don't have a number on that. And it's one of these things that's tricky, tricky to get really definitive information. There's not sort of a comprehensive database like of photos of all the murals anywhere. You can find good photos in different places, and you kind of have to hunt for it a little bit. And it's, then there's complicated things like sometimes the buildings, then, you know, things change, buildings move from being post offices to being something else. That's, USPS no longer owns the building, you know, different things happen. So it's a little hard to track down the exact history and put numbers on it. But I don't think it's been a very high number. I mean, most of them, it's about 2/3 of them are still standing. There's some that have been lost for other reasons, buildings being torn down, different things. Like, you know, it's been almost 100 years since these murals, you know, were first initiated. So lots has changed. But it hasn't been very many where they just outright say, okay, you know, we got to take this down, it's too offensive. Right. I think it's more common for, you know, the community to get involved and there to be a sort of coming to consensus of, you know, what should we do, and providing more of that explanatory text, rather than just saying, you know, we just can't have it on view.
Yeah. And I'd add to that with the conversations I've had with people at USPS about some of these problematic murals. They have realized that if they cover the murals up without any sort of explanation as to why, it tends to actually draw more attention to it. So they do sometimes kind of find themselves stuck between a rock and a hard place, where it's like, well, understandably people don't want to see it, but if we cover it up, then people ask questions and then they find out about it. And so there is trying to find that balance for them that works. Alexa has asked, because we work at one of the lesser attended Smithsonians, what is the best way they can incorporate postal art into their STEM classroom? And I'm going to start by dealing with the stamps, if that's okay, give you a chance to catch your breath, Maureen, since you've been talking a lot. So Alexa, stamps are an incredible resource that really are kind of, the opportunities are limitless, you know, depending on what you're studying in your STEM classroom. There's certainly going to be some connections to that topic actually portrayed on the images themselves. So, you know, I know off the top of my head, I've been in conversation with people about doing curriculum guides relating to clouds, because there's been a whole series of clouds on stamps. Same with like a lot of like aeronautical and space exploration. There's a ton of stamps that portray, you know, technological innovations. So you can use them as a kind of a case study for that topic. And similarly, a lot of famous scientists and astronomers and biologists have been them as individuals have been portrayed on stamps. I think another opportunity that people don't necessarily think of is the concept of stamp production and how that ties into STEM. So, depending on when stamps were produced, particularly earlier on when they were etchings that were printed, there's a lot of chemicals and therefore chemistry involved in the process of making the image, etching it into the metal, the technology of the printing press, the chemicals associated with the ink that was used. Then you also have, once you have this sheet of stamps, which is not necessarily how they're released today, but originally would be large sheets with roughly 100 stamps on each sheet. You can do a lot of work with them with math and ratios, and then measurements of distance. So geometry is really, really quite a limitless opportunity on those giant sheets. And then also the perforations, which are the circles that they used to puncture to create the separation where you could tear the stamps apart. There's a whole subworld on studying perforation sizes. And so that can be certainly used for some math work as well. Our digital collection on our website has some really incredibly high quality photographs of individual stamps and stamp sheets. So if you go there and download them through our open access policy, you should be able to use a lot of these images in your classroom, even though it may sound like there's too much precision necessary for you to be able to incorporate them. They're pretty solid on that. Maureen, do you have anything to add?
Just a plug for my Stamp Stories video series, depending on the age of the children. I have a set of videos for young learners that incorporates stamps and collection items from other Smithsonian units. And we just did one on telescopes. So that's certainly STEM related. And there's several in the series that are. So I see that our next question asks about, is there a collection of these murals that we can access along with the demographic data about how many members of underrepresented groups are on the mural. So I wish that there were a really comprehensive database. There's really isn't, but there are a few good places to look. The website, The Living New Deal, has wonderful information about post office murals, very comprehensive. They provide photographs when they can, but they don't have photographs for all. Wikipedia actually has a very good article about post office murals where it lists them out by state and city or town. And again, it doesn't have photos for all of them, but it does provide a lot of the photos of them. Mm-hmm. There are a number of texts that have been written about post office murals, although those tend to be state by state. So if you're interested in, say, murals in Texas or murals in Nebraska, there are a number of textbooks or more nonfiction texts about that. And I would also check the Smithsonian American Art Museum's website. They actually have a research fellow with them right now who did her PhD thesis on racial representation in post office murals. And I was able to find a couple of papers that she wrote on this topic by doing a Smithsonian collection search. So it's a little bit of, hunting around and pulling together from different sources. And I wish that there were something that were sort of one-stop shopping for that. But it is kind of, you kind of have to really do a little bit of research and kind of pull things in from different sources to get a clear picture.
Right. I think we got time for one more question. Actually, real quick, Leslie, in answer to your question, you can find Stamp Stories on our website, which is postalmuseum.si.edu. But then the last real question, thank you for putting it in the chat. The last question is, what can we do to push for more diversity or inclusion in these murals? And I think that's a great question. If I may, Maureen, unfortunately, these are historic murals and the Postal Service isn't currently actively creating any new ones. But when it comes to diversity and inclusion on postage stamps, they are working really hard to be better at that. But the best way to have your voice heard on that is to create your own stamp idea and submit it to CSAC, like I suggested earlier. I know that adds to the 30,000 that they get each year, but certainly the more that they have, the more likely they are to be fully inclusive and reflective of American culture and history. And with that, I think we're going to have to say thank you and goodbye. Thank you, everybody, so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Maureen or I directly.
And we hope that you enjoy the rest of the summit.